The headlights of a rusted pickup truck cut through the pouring rain just as a luxury black SUV rolled to a helpless stop on an empty highway outside Seattle. A woman in a soaked business suit stood beside it, desperately waving at passing cars that never slowed down. Her phone had no signal. The temperature kept dropping. Then the old pickup pulled over. Without asking for money or even her name, Ethan Brooks quietly opened the hood and began fixing the engine with nothing more than a flashlight and a worn toolbox. 12 hours earlier, that same man had walked out of Langford Logistics carrying a cardboard box after being fired in front of hundreds of employees. His 8-year-old daughter was waiting at home, unaware that her father had just lost the only job keeping a roof over their heads. Yet despite everything, Ethan chose kindness over bitterness. Minutes later, the engine roared back to life. The woman reached for her wallet, but Ethan simply smiled and said, "No one deserves to be stranded alone at midnight." As the SUV's headlights illuminated his face, the woman's blood froze. She recognized him instantly. He was the warehouse supervisor she had personally dismissed that very morning. Ethan looked up, recognized the CEO who had destroyed his career, and calmly walked away without another word. But if he was truly innocent, who had manipulated her into firing the best employee in the company? The morning shift at Langford Logistics Distribution Center usually began with the rhythmic symphony of forklifts humming across polished concrete floors, barcode scanners chirping in rapid succession, and dozens of workers moving with practiced precision. Ethan Brooks had spent the last 9 years making sure that rhythm never broke. At 36, he wasn't the loudest supervisor in the warehouse, nor the most ambitious, but every employee respected him because he never asked anyone to do a job he wouldn't do himself. Whether it meant unloading trucks in freezing rain, climbing onto a loading dock to solve a jammed conveyor, or staying 3 extra hours so a new employee wouldn't face impossible deadlines alone. Ethan always chose responsibility over convenience. That reputation had earned him the trust of hundreds of workers, but on this particular Monday morning, trust suddenly meant nothing. The first sign that something was wrong came when Richard Kane, the company's chief operating officer, walked into Warehouse 3 accompanied by 2 corporate security officers and the human resources director. Richard rarely visited the warehouse unless television cameras were nearby or an important investor was touring the facility. His expensive tailored suit looked strangely out of place among steel shelves stacked 40 feet high with consumer electronics waiting to be shipped across the Pacific Northwest. Every conversation around the warehouse faded into uncomfortable silence as workers watched the executives march directly toward Ethan. Richard's expression carried none of his usual polished confidence. Instead, it wore the cold certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome before asking a single question. "Mr. Brooks," Richard said loudly enough for nearby employees to hear, "I'd like you to come with us to Conference Room B immediately." Ethan noticed dozens of worried faces turning toward him. Miguel, one of the forklift operators Ethan had trained years earlier, looked ready to ask what was happening. But Ethan simply gave him a reassuring nod before following the executives upstairs. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere felt heavy enough to suffocate. A large monitor displayed inventory reports, shipment schedules, and security photographs. The human resources director avoided eye contact while placing a folder on the polished table. Richard remained standing near the window, folding his arms with theatrical disappointment. "Last Friday night," Richard began, "one of our outbound containers disappeared before reaching the port of Seattle." Ethan frowned. "Disappeared?" Richard clicked a remote. Satellite images appeared on the screen, followed by inventory spreadsheets highlighting missing merchandise. High-end electronics worth nearly $3 million. Ethan stared at the numbers in disbelief. Such a theft would require careful planning, forged documentation, and cooperation from multiple departments. No single warehouse supervisor could make an entire shipping container vanish. "Security footage shows your authorization code opening Dock 7 at 11:42 p.m., Richard continued. Another image appeared. A grainy security recording showed someone wearing a reflective warehouse jacket entering the loading area. The face was impossible to distinguish. "That isn't enough to identify anyone," Ethan replied calmly. "My access card can be cloned. Hundreds of people wear identical jackets." Richard ignored the objection. "Your electronic signature approved the shipment. Then someone forged it. Your password was used. Passwords can be stolen." Convenient answer. Ethan looked toward human resources. "Has anyone checked the server logs, login locations, security backups?" No one answered. Instead, Richard slid a termination document across the table. "The board expects immediate accountability." Ethan slowly read the paperwork. It stated that he had violated company policy, authorized unauthorized shipments, and failed to protect corporate assets. There was no mention of an investigation, no forensic analysis, no witness interviews. Everything had already been decided. "You're firing me before proving I did anything," Ethan said quietly. "The evidence is overwhelming," Richard replied. "No, the evidence is incomplete." Richard leaned closer across the table. Sometimes companies must act quickly to protect their reputation. Ethan met his eyes without flinching. Or to protect someone else's. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across Richard's face. Surprise followed immediately by irritation. Before either man could speak again, the conference room door opened. Victoria Langford stepped inside. At 34, the newly appointed CEO carried herself with effortless authority, despite inheriting the company only 6 months earlier after her father's retirement. Employees described her as brilliant, disciplined, and emotionally distant. Every decision she made was driven by data efficiency and shareholder confidence. She glanced briefly at Ethan before looking at the documents prepared on the table. "Has legal reviewed everything?" she asked. Richard nodded immediately. "Every report confirms Mr. Brooks was responsible." Victoria flipped through several pages in silence. Ethan studied her expression, hoping to see hesitation, curiosity, anything suggesting she questioned the conclusions. Instead, she found the signature page, uncapped a silver fountain pen, and signed the termination order with one smooth motion. The scratching sound of ink across paper echoed through the room like a judge's gavel. Human Resources quietly pushed another copy toward Ethan. "Your employment ends effective immediately." Ethan looked at Victoria. "May I ask you one question?" She finally met his eyes. "Go ahead." "Did you personally investigate this?" A brief pause filled the room. "I reviewed the reports submitted to me." "Reports written by the same people who benefit if I'm blamed." Richard interrupted. "That's enough." Ethan ignored him. "You built your decision on paperwork instead of people." Victoria's expression remained controlled, though something in her eyes shifted ever so slightly. "A company of this size depends on facts." "No," Ethan answered. "A company survives on truth. They're not always the same thing." Neither executive responded. Ethan slowly signed the acknowledgement that he had received the termination documents, not because he admitted guilt, but because refusing would change nothing. He removed his employee identification badge and placed it gently on the conference table. 9 years of loyalty reduced to a piece of plastic. Before leaving, he looked directly at Victoria one last time. "One day you'll discover you trusted the wrong person. I just hope it isn't too late." "Yay." Then, he walked out without raising his voice, without arguing, and without begging for another chance. Downstairs, word had already spread. Entire warehouse sections had stopped working. Employees pretended to organize pallets while secretly watching Ethan carry a small cardboard box containing family photographs, a coffee mug decorated with crayon drawings, and a tiny pink unicorn keychain Lily had insisted would bring him good luck every day at work. Miguel hurried over. "Boss, tell me this isn't real." Ethan forced a smile. "Take care of the crew." Everyone knows you didn't steal anything. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on the younger man's shoulder. Knowing and proving are two different things. Another employee quietly slipped an envelope into Ethan's pocket. We collected some money. Ethan immediately handed it back. Use it for someone's medical bills or groceries. You'll need it more than I do. Tears filled the employee's eyes. As Ethan crossed the warehouse one final time, dozens of workers lowered their heads in silent respect. No applause, no dramatic speeches, just quiet gratitude for the man who had always stood beside them. Outside, the summer sun felt strangely cold. Ethan climbed into his 12-year-old pickup truck and rested both hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. His savings would cover perhaps 6 weeks of rent if he was careful. Lily's school tuition was due in less than a month. Her asthma medication wasn't cheap. The refrigerator already needed repairs, and the old pickup consumed gasoline almost as quickly as he could afford to buy it. For the first time since returning home from military service more than a decade earlier, genuine fear settled into his chest. Not fear for himself, but fear of disappointing the little girl waiting for him every evening with endless questions about dinosaurs' homework, and whether pancakes counted as dinner if they were shaped like hearts. Ethan took a long breath, started the truck, and drove toward the small suburban house that had never seemed so fragile. Long before he reached home, he had already made one promise to himself. No matter how unfair the day had been, Lily would never see defeat in her father's eyes. Even if it meant working every hour of every night, he would find another way to keep their small family standing. Ethan pulled into the narrow driveway just before 4 in the afternoon, taking an extra moment before stepping out of the truck. The little blue house wasn't much to look at, but every inch of it carried memories that no amount of money could replace. He had painted the porch with Lily one summer, laughing as she accidentally left tiny handprints on the railing. The flower beds along the walkway had been planted by his late wife, Emily, whose favorite daisies still bloomed every spring despite years of neglect. Losing Emily to cancer had nearly destroyed him, but every morning he reminded himself that Lily had already lost one parent. She could not lose another, even if that loss came in the form of hopelessness instead of death. He picked up the cardboard box from the passenger seat, tucked the termination papers underneath the family photographs, and forced a smile before opening the front door. "Daddy." 8-year-old Lily raced across the living room, nearly knocking him backward with the force of her hug. Her backpack bounced against her shoulders as she wrapped both arms around his waist. "Guess what? I got an A on my science project." Ethan knelt and hugged her tightly, grateful that she couldn't see the tears threatening to form in his eyes. "I knew you would," he said warmly. "You're smarter than your old man." Lily giggled. "Mrs. Jenkins said I explained volcanoes better than the 5th graders. Then I'd better be careful. Pretty soon you'll be teaching me." She proudly pulled a folded certificate from her backpack, and Ethan admired it as if it were the greatest achievement in the world. For a few precious minutes, the crushing weight of losing his job disappeared. There was only a father celebrating his daughter's small victory. After dinner, which consisted of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, Lily sat at the kitchen table finishing her homework while Ethan quietly opened his laptop. He logged into his online banking account. The numbers on the screen made his stomach tighten. After paying the mortgage, utilities, insurance, and Emily's remaining medical debt, their savings had dropped to less than $12,000. It sounded like a comfortable amount until he calculated how quickly monthly expenses would consume it. If he couldn't find another job within 6 weeks, they would begin falling behind. If it lasted 3 months, they might lose the house. He closed the laptop before Lily noticed the concern on his face. "Daddy?" she asked without looking up from her math worksheet. "Yeah, sweetheart. Are you going to work tonight?" Ethan hesitated. He had never lied to her before, but he wasn't ready to tell her the truth. "Not tonight." "Good." She smiled. "Can we watch that old superhero movie?" "Absolutely." They curled up together on the worn couch beneath Emily's handmade quilt. Halfway through the movie, Lily fell asleep with her head resting against his shoulder. Ethan gently carried her upstairs, tucked her into bed, and stood silently beside the framed photograph on her nightstand. It showed the three of them at the beach years earlier, Emily laughing as the wind blew her hair across her face, while Ethan held a much younger Lily on his shoulders. "I'm trying," he whispered to the photograph. "I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out." The next morning, Ethan woke before sunrise and began searching for work. He sent applications to warehouses across Seattle, Tacoma, and Bellevue. By lunchtime, the first rejection email arrived. Another followed an hour later. Then another. Most companies had already heard about the missing shipment at Langford Logistics. Although no criminal charges had been filed, the rumor spread quickly enough to stain his reputation. Employers weren't interested in explanations. They simply moved on to safer candidates. By the end of the third day, Ethan had submitted 37 applications and received 21 rejections. Several companies never responded at all. On Friday afternoon, his phone rang. Hope briefly returned when he saw an unfamiliar business number. "Mr. Brooks," a recruiter asked politely, "we were impressed with your experience." "Thank you. Unfortunately, after completing a background review, we've decided to move forward with another applicant. May I ask why?" There was a brief silence. "Your previous employer expressed concerns regarding inventory management." The call ended less than 30 seconds later. Ethan lowered the phone and stared through the windshield of his parked truck. Richard Kane hadn't merely fired him. Someone had made sure his professional reputation collapsed with him. That evening, after Lily had gone to sleep, Ethan drove to the modest auto repair garage that had belonged to his father decades earlier. The building had long since been sold, but his father's closest friend, Frank Dawson, still owned it. Frank was in his late 60s with permanently grease-stained hands and a beard that seemed to collect motor oil no matter how often he washed it. He looked up from beneath the hood of an aging pickup truck and smiled. "Haven't seen you around here in months." Ethan returned the smile, though it carried little joy. "I lost my job." Frank immediately climbed out from under the truck. "What happened?" Ethan briefly explained the accusations, leaving out most of the anger. Frank listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the old mechanic shook his head. "Your father always said a man's reputation takes a lifetime to build and 5 minutes to destroy." Ethan nodded quietly. "I'm not looking for sympathy. I just need work." Frank looked around the nearly empty garage. Business had slowed during the past year because larger chain repair shops had opened nearby. "I can't afford another full-time mechanic." "I don't need full-time." "Then what? Evenings, nights, weekends. Pay me only when customers come in." Frank studied him for a long moment before tossing him a pair of old work gloves. "You still remember how to rebuild a transmission?" Ethan caught the gloves. "Try me." Frank laughed for the first time all day. "Good. Mrs. Patterson's minivan has been waiting 3 days because my knees are too old to crawl underneath it." For the next 4 hours, Ethan worked without stopping. Years spent helping his father had never left him. His hands instinctively knew where every bolt belonged, how every engine sounded when something wasn't quite right, and how to diagnose problems simply by listening. By closing time, 3 vehicles had been repaired. Frank watched in amazement. "You're faster now than your old man ever was?" Ethan wiped grease from his hands. He'd disagree. Frank reached into the cash register and handed him a modest envelope. "It's not much." Ethan counted the money. It was barely enough to cover groceries for a week, but it represented something more important than the amount itself. It was proof that he could still provide. As he prepared to leave, Frank stopped him again. "There's one more thing." "What's that?" "People keep calling after hours because their cars break down on the highway. I usually can't help them anymore." Ethan looked up. Frank continued. Take my old roadside repair kit. If someone calls at midnight, you go. Keep whatever they pay." Ethan stared at the dented red toolbox sitting beside the office door. It had once belonged to his father. The faded initials JB were still scratched into the metal lid. His father had carried that same toolbox through countless freezing nights to rescue stranded strangers without ever asking whether the trip was worth the money. Ethan gently picked it up, feeling the familiar weight in his hands. "I'll take good care of it." Frank smiled softly. "I know you will." Over the following week, Ethan developed a new routine. Every morning, he helped Lily get ready for school, packed her lunch, and continued searching for jobs that never came. Every afternoon, he prepared dinner before picking her up from school. Every evening after she fell asleep under the care of their kind, elderly neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, he drove the pickup truck through the streets of Seattle, carrying the old red toolbox in the back. Some nights he earned nothing. Other nights he replaced dead batteries, changed flat tires, repaired overheating engines, or jump-started exhausted cars stranded on lonely roads. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly wasn't enough to replace his old salary, but every dollar meant another day Lily could remain in the only home she had ever known. Ethan never realized that one ordinary midnight service call on a deserted highway would soon place him face to face with the woman who had unknowingly destroyed his career, and that a single act of compassion would begin exposing a conspiracy far larger than either of them could possibly imagine. The rain began just after 11 that night, turning the empty highways outside Seattle into ribbons of shimmering black glass. Ethan Brooks had already spent 3 hours replacing batteries, changing a blown tire for an exhausted college student, and helping an elderly couple whose pickup truck had overheated on Interstate 5. The old red toolbox sat beside him on the passenger seat, its dented metal surface illuminated by the dashboard lights. Every time he glanced at it, he remembered his father's words. "A mechanic doesn't just fix machines, son. Sometimes he fixes someone's worst day." Those words had stayed with Ethan long after his father was gone. Tonight they mattered more than ever. His phone buzzed just as he considered heading home. The caller ID belonged to Frank's garage. "Ethan?" Frank's tired voice crackled through the speaker. "State Patrol just reported a stranded vehicle on County Road 17. Luxury SUV. Female driver. Engine failure. She's been waiting almost 40 minutes because every tow truck is tied up in the storm." Ethan checked the clock. It was nearly midnight. "I'm on my way." 20 minutes later, his aging pickup rounded a bend and spotted flashing hazard lights reflecting across sheets of rain. A black luxury SUV sat motionless on the shoulder steam drifting from beneath its hood. Nearby stood a woman in a dark business suit, soaked despite trying to shield herself beneath a useless umbrella that the wind kept threatening to tear away. Several cars sped past without slowing. Ethan pulled safely behind the SUV, switched on his emergency flashers, grabbed the red toolbox, and walked through the downpour. "Evening," he called calmly. "Looks like you've had better nights." The woman turned quickly, clearly startled, before relief replaced the fear on her face. "Thank God someone finally stopped." Her voice remained composed, but Ethan could hear the exhaustion beneath it. "My phone keeps losing signal and roadside assistance says it'll be another 2 hours. Ethan nodded. "Let's see what we've got." Without asking who she was or what she did for a living, he lifted the hood. Steam burst into the cold night air. He examined the engine compartment with a flashlight, listening carefully before touching anything. Years of experience allowed him to recognize problems that diagnostic computers often missed. Within moments, he spotted a cracked radiator hose that had sprayed coolant across the engine. He also noticed a loose electrical connector that had likely triggered the dashboard warning system. "Nothing catastrophic," he said. "Just unfortunate timing." The woman released a breath she had apparently been holding for almost an hour. "Can you actually fix it?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Temporary repair, yes. Permanent repair tomorrow." She stepped back while he worked with quiet efficiency. He cut away the damaged section of hose, installed an emergency connector from his repair kit, tightened the clamps, refilled the cooling system with spare coolant from his truck, then secured the electrical connection. Rain soaked through his jacket, but he never complained. The woman watched him with growing curiosity. Most roadside mechanics she had encountered in the past had spent the first 5 minutes discussing prices. This man hadn't mentioned money once. After nearly 30 minutes, Ethan closed the hood. "Try it now." She climbed behind the wheel and turned the key. The engine hesitated for only a second before settling into a smooth idle. Her eyes widened with surprise. "I can't believe it." Ethan listened carefully for another few seconds, then nodded with satisfaction. "Keep your speed under 60. Drive straight home or to the nearest hotel. Replace the hose first thing tomorrow." She stepped out of the vehicle, reaching into her designer handbag. "Please." She pulled several $100 bills from her wallet. "Take this." Ethan shook his head. "The repair doesn't cost that much." "Then keep the rest." "I can't." "Why not?" He simply shrugged. "Because someone else might need it more than I do." She stared at him, confused. The old pickup truck behind him looked like it had survived a decade of hard labor. His work boots were worn. Rain dripped from the sleeves of his faded jacket. Everything about him suggested a man who could certainly use the money. "At least let me pay you fairly," she insisted. Ethan accepted only enough cash to cover the repair materials and fuel. He handed the remaining bills back to her. No one deserves to be stranded alone in the middle of the night. For the first time since he had arrived, their eyes truly met. A flash of lightning illuminated his face with startling clarity. The woman froze. Her breathing stopped. The calm blue eyes, the strong jaw, the familiar scar near his left eyebrow. She had seen them only once before across a polished conference table less than 15 hours earlier. "Mr. Brooks," she whispered. Ethan looked more closely at her face. Rain had washed away much of her makeup, and her soaked hair no longer resembled the perfectly styled executive he remembered, but there was no mistaking her. Victoria Langford, the woman whose signature had ended his career. For several silent seconds, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were falling rain and the steady rumble of the repaired engine. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. Every sentence Ethan had spoken during the termination meeting echoed inside her mind. "One day you'll discover you trusted the wrong person." Yet here he was, kneeling in the rain to repair her vehicle after she had taken away the only income supporting his daughter. I didn't recognize you," she admitted quietly. Ethan offered a tired but genuine smile. "You weren't expecting to find your former warehouse supervisor on the side of the road." "After everything that happened today, why did you help me?" she asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question she genuinely couldn't answer herself. Ethan looked toward the dark highway before replying. "Because your car broke down. That's all I needed to know." Victoria lowered her eyes. "You should hate me." "Maybe." Ethan's voice remained calm. "But if I let bitterness decide who deserves help eventually, I'd become the kind of man my daughter wouldn't recognize." The words struck Victoria harder than any criticism could have. Throughout her career, she had believed strong leaders made difficult decisions without allowing emotions to interfere. She had signed hundreds of contracts, dismissed underperforming executives, closed failing divisions, and never questioned herself afterward. Yet this felt different. The man standing before her wasn't arrogant, manipulative, or resentful. He had every reason to humiliate her refuse assistants or simply drive away. Instead, he had risked getting soaked in freezing rain for someone who had unknowingly shattered his life. "Mr. Brooks." She began searching for words that refused to come. "I'm sorry." Ethan gently shook his head. Don't apologize tonight. She looked up. Then when you know whether you fired the right man. His answer lingered in the cold air. He closed the toolbox, carried it back toward his pickup, and climbed inside without another word. Victoria watched the old truck disappear into the rain until its taillights vanished beyond the curve of the highway. She remained standing beside her perfectly functioning SUV for several minutes, unable to move. Every instinct that had guided her as CEO suddenly felt unreliable. Richard Kane had insisted the evidence was overwhelming. The reports had looked convincing. The numbers had aligned perfectly. But the man she had just met was not the thief those reports described. A guilty man would have welcomed revenge. Ethan Brooks had chosen compassion instead. As Victoria finally drove away through the storm, one thought refused to leave her mind. If Ethan was innocent, then someone inside Langford Logistics had manipulated not only the investigation but her as well. And for the first time since becoming CEO, Victoria wondered whether the greatest threat to her company wasn't outside its walls but sitting inside the executive boardroom she trusted most. Victoria barely slept after the encounter on the highway. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan standing in the rain refusing hundreds of dollars from the very woman who had destroyed his career. By sunrise, she had made a decision that could either save her company or destroy her own reputation. Instead of driving straight to the executive floor, she headed to the Information Security Department. She requested complete access logs, raw surveillance footage, and server authentication records connected to the missing shipment. The IT manager looked surprised. "Mr. Kane already instructed us to archive the case," he said cautiously. "I know," Victoria replied. "I'm giving a different instruction." Within an hour, the first inconsistency appeared. Ethan's employee credentials had supposedly authorized the shipment at 11:42 p.m., yet the system also showed his badge entering the employee parking garage at exactly the same minute from the opposite side of the property. Physically, it was impossible. Someone had duplicated or manipulated the records. Victoria quietly copied every file onto an encrypted drive before Richard Kane could learn she had reopened the investigation. Meanwhile, Ethan continued working nights, unaware that the CEO had begun questioning everything she believed about his dismissal. During the day, he searched unsuccessfully for permanent employment, and every rejection letter reminded him how completely his reputation had been ruined. Late one afternoon, Victoria arrived at Frank Dawson's repair garage in a simple gray sedan instead of her usual chauffeured limousine. She wore jeans, a baseball cap, and no designer jewelry, hoping not to attract attention. Ethan was beneath the hood of an aging pickup truck when she walked into the garage. Frank glanced between the two of them, sensing the tension, then quietly disappeared into the office. Ethan wiped grease from his hands before speaking. "Your radiator holding up." Victoria almost smiled. "Perfectly." Silence followed. Finally, she took a deep breath. "You were right." Ethan folded his arms. "About what?" "Something doesn't make sense." She handed him a printed copy of the access logs. Ethan studied the timestamps for less than 30 seconds before pointing at 2 entries. "These were edited." Victoria looked surprised. "How can you tell?" "The authentication sequence changed. Whoever altered it forgot that the warehouse scanners record milliseconds, not just seconds." Victoria stared at him. None of the company's internal investigators had noticed that detail. Ethan continued reading before shaking his head. "This wasn't done by a warehouse supervisor." "Then who?" Ethan looked directly into her eyes. "Someone with executive-level system privileges." Neither of them spoke Richard Kane's name aloud, but they were thinking the same thing. Over the next several days, Victoria continued her investigation without informing the board of directors. She requested shipping invoices from previous months and discovered a disturbing pattern. High-value containers had repeatedly vanished from inventory before being marked as administrative errors. The losses were individually small enough to avoid attracting attention, but together totaled tens of millions of dollars over several years. Every suspicious shipment carried final approval from the COO's office. Victoria felt a chill run through her body. Richard hadn't simply framed Ethan. He had likely been stealing from the company for years. Determined to confirm her suspicions, she secretly met Ethan one evening at a quiet waterfront cafe far from corporate headquarters. She spread dozens of documents across the table. "Look at the shipment numbers," she whispered. Ethan compared invoices, loading manifests, and trucking schedules. After several minutes, he circled 3 container identification codes with a pen. "These don't belong." "Why?" "Because these containers never entered Warehouse 3. Victoria frowned. "The records say they did." Ethan shook his head. "I designed the storage layout myself. Those container numbers belong to refrigerated cargo, but they're assigned to dry storage locations that don't even have electrical connections." Victoria's eyes widened. "So the paperwork was fabricated." "Not fabricated." Ethan leaned closer. "Recycled." She looked confused. "Explain." "Someone reused identification numbers from legitimate shipments to hide stolen cargo. It's sophisticated enough that ordinary audits would never notice." Victoria realized she was sitting across from the one person capable of exposing the entire operation. Ethan had managed warehouse logistics long enough to recognize patterns invisible to executives who rarely stepped onto the loading docks. For the first time, they weren't former employer and employee. They were partners searching for the same truth. Unfortunately, they weren't the only ones asking questions. Richard Kane noticed almost immediately that Victoria had begun requesting files she had never shown interest in before. He instructed corporate security to monitor access logs and quietly ordered one of his loyal managers to follow Ethan whenever possible. 2 nights later, after finishing another roadside repair, Ethan returned to the garage and discovered someone had broken inside. Tool cabinets lay overturned across the floor. Shelves had been emptied. Filing boxes containing repair invoices had been ripped apart. Nothing valuable had been stolen. It wasn't a robbery. It was a warning. Frank stood in disbelief. "Who would do this?" Ethan slowly examined the damage. Whoever had entered knew exactly which cabinets contained paperwork rather than expensive equipment. They had been searching for something specific. His phone rang. Victoria's voice sounded unusually tense. "Are you all right?" "Someone trashed the garage." A long silence followed. "The same thing happened today at headquarters," she admitted. "My office computer was accessed while I was in a board meeting." Ethan's expression hardened. "They're watching us." Before Victoria could respond, Ethan noticed a black SUV parked across the street. The engine was running. Dark-tinted windows concealed whoever sat inside. The vehicle drove away the moment he looked toward it. Later that evening, Victoria reviewed building security footage from corporate headquarters. A familiar figure entered her office during the board meeting using a master access card assigned only to executive leadership. Although the camera angle failed to capture the person's face, the expensive silver cufflinks and distinctive watch matched accessories Richard Kane wore almost every day. She realized the investigation had become far more dangerous than she imagined. They weren't merely exposing financial fraud. They were threatening an organized criminal operation operating from inside one of the region's largest logistics companies. The following morning, Victoria met Ethan at a quiet public park instead of another restaurant. Neither trusted private locations anymore. As Lily laughed nearby on the playground with Mrs. Alvarez, Victoria handed Ethan a flash drive. "Everything I've found is on here." Ethan slipped it into his pocket. "If something happens to you," Victoria nodded, "release everything." Ethan looked toward his daughter before answering. "Nothing is going to happen." Victoria wished she shared his confidence. Across the street, unnoticed by both of them, a man lowered a camera after photographing the meeting. Minutes later, the images were transmitted directly to Richard Kane's private phone. As he studied the photographs from his executive office, Richard's polite smile slowly disappeared. He had underestimated Ethan Brooks once. He would not make the same mistake again. Quietly picking up another phone that never appeared on company records, Richard made a single call before speaking only 6 chilling words. "Take care of both of them tonight." The warning came too late. As Ethan drove Lily home that evening, he noticed the same black SUV following them through 3 consecutive turns. Instead of heading home, he calmly diverted toward the local police precinct. The SUV accelerated briefly before disappearing into traffic, confirming everything he and Victoria feared. Realizing they no longer had time to build a perfect case, Victoria made the boldest decision of her career. She called an emergency meeting of Langford Logistics' board of directors and invited the company's outside auditors, legal counsel, and federal investigators she had quietly contacted the previous night. Richard Kane entered the boardroom wearing his usual confident smile, unaware that the entire meeting had been carefully orchestrated. As the presentation began, Victoria remained unusually calm. One by one, she projected the original security logs, the altered authentication records, financial transfers linked to shell companies, duplicated container identification numbers, and surveillance footage showing unauthorized access to her office using an executive master key. Richard repeatedly interrupted, calling the evidence circumstantial, until Ethan quietly entered the room, carrying the old red toolbox that had once belonged to his father. He wasn't there as a mechanic. He was there as the warehouse supervisor who knew every shipment that had ever passed through those loading docks. Standing before the stunned board, Ethan explained how container numbers had been recycled to hide stolen cargo, how inventory reports had been manipulated over several years, and how only someone with executive authority could authorize the changes without triggering automatic alerts. Then Victoria revealed the final piece of evidence, a confidential statement from one of Richard's former logistics coordinators, who had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for protection after learning innocent employees were being framed. The room fell silent. Richard's confident expression finally cracked. He attempted to leave, but 2 federal agents waiting outside the boardroom stepped forward and informed him he was under arrest for conspiracy wire fraud, corporate theft, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering. As he was escorted away in handcuffs, Richard glared at Ethan with undisguised hatred, but Ethan simply watched without satisfaction. Justice, he knew, was never about revenge. It was about ensuring no one else suffered the same injustice. The investigation that followed cleared Ethan of every accusation. News outlets reported that the respected warehouse supervisor had been framed while exposing one of the largest internal corruption schemes in the company's history. Former co-workers flooded him with messages of support, and companies that had once rejected his applications suddenly competed to hire him. At a company-wide meeting attended by hundreds of employees, Victoria stood on the same stage where Ethan had once walked out carrying a cardboard box. This time, she faced every employee with complete honesty. "Leadership is not measured by how quickly we make decisions," she admitted. "It is measured by whether we have the courage to question them when something feels wrong. I failed one of our best people because I trusted reports instead of character." She then publicly apologized to Ethan and offered to restore his former position with full compensation, back pay, and additional benefits. Ethan thanked her sincerely, but surprised everyone with his answer. "I don't want my old job back," he said. "I want to build something where integrity isn't just a slogan on the wall." Rather than feeling disappointed, Victoria smiled. "Then let me invest in it." Months later, Ethan opened Brooks Logistics Solutions, a company built on transparency, respect, and accountability. Langford Logistics became its first strategic partner under Victoria's leadership, and together they introduced new auditing systems that protected employees instead of sacrificing them for convenience. Victoria visited the office often, not as an untouchable CEO, but as a trusted business partner and friend. Lily adored her proudly showing off school projects whenever Victoria stopped by, and the laughter that gradually returned to Ethan's home reminded him that healing often arrives quietly. One rainy evening, nearly a year after their unforgettable meeting on the roadside, Ethan and Victoria stood outside the new company headquarters, watching employees leave for the day. Victoria smiled as raindrops began falling once again. Funny how everything changed because one man stopped to help a stranger. Ethan looked toward the highway in the distance and smiled back. You never really know whose life you're fixing when you choose to do the right thing. In that moment, both of them understood that compassion had accomplished what anger never could. A single act of kindness had uncovered the truth, restored justice, healed broken lives, and proved that integrity, no matter how costly in the beginning, always finds its way back home.